It's a busy time for people who want to comment about religious education in schools in England, even at a time when there's a lot of news about. Ofsted's report, which is highly critical on the state of religious education in schools, did attract a lot of commentary. And a lot of people were rather baffled by, I think, the title, religious education, the notorious RE, known to early generations as divinity.
Mm-hmm.
And the report talks about the differences between religion and non-religion as being very important for the understanding of the minds of people going through our secondary schools. This seems to me a very difficult subject.
It is, and I think it's interesting that Ofsted has been publishing these reports on key areas of the curriculum. And they have done English, science and maths, which we're used to as the sort of tripod on which modern secondary education is based. What is absolutely fascinating, I think, is that the first subject they then chose to tackle was religious education. Now that perhaps says something about the complexity, which I think we're going to talk about. It says something about the fact that it is important, which I think we'll talk about as well. But also perhaps says something about the parlous state that it's in. I suspect this was more a crisis report than perhaps a report into history or geography might have been.
Remedial action needed and
Yes.
recommended
Yes.
by Ofsted, and further deep dives are required in the dread jargon of officialese and bureaucracy in our country. This requirement to have religious education in schools, it's a legal requirement, isn't it?
Absolutely. So one of the reasons why, again, this is the fourth subject that they've chosen to tackle, and the first of the outside that sort of milking stool 3 set of subjects, is because it is in fact compulsory, and I think a lot of people don't necessarily realise that.
Is it compulsory under the terms of the 1944 famous Butler Act?
That is correct. The Butler Act is around which essentially all education legislation since has sort of been built. There's been fiddling around the edges, not least most recently with the Academies Acts and things like that. But fundamentally, what is taught and what is needed to be taught and what is considered an education, to choose the second half of that phrase, religious education, what is considered an education is still broadly defined according to the terms of the Butler Act, which makes religious education compulsory.
It's not part of the core curriculum.
No.
You don't have to sit a public exam.
No, you do not have to sit a public exam. And what is very interesting is the report has distinguished quite distinctly between the provision of religious education for those who are sitting exams and the provision of religious education more generally. And the latter is in a particularly parlous state. There are issues with the former, which I think we'll talk about in a moment. But essentially what this report has identified is that the requirement of the Butler Act in 1944, which has been continued in amendments and new acts ever since for religious education to take place, that compulsory religious education that is not examined is in a parlous state.
Now, to go back to what the report has been describing as the differences between religion and non-religion, terms that they actually use, and sometimes it seemed to me as if they were advocating or discussing the teaching of non-religion as, after all, in a sense, a religion.
Yes.
I mean, Smith was very familiar with rather tedious lectures and books that go into the sources of atheism as a form of religion.
Yes.
In order to be against God, you have to have a kind of knowledge
Concept.
about God to begin with, so that's pretty theological. But what actually do you think religious education should be? What do we learn from this report into the parlous state of religious education? What's the religious in religious education? Because it's not like as it were political education.
No.
Or environmental studies, or geography, talking about earlier, which has evolved as subjects and has now aspects of social science in it. It's become rather more a left-wing kind of subject in some areas than it was in the days when knowledge of Oxbow Lakes was enough to get you a decent pass.
Igneous Rock.
Igneous Rock and all that. But religious education, to do things religiously, to have a religious regard for something, this is a word that is used very, very loosely.
It is, and in the report, I think the reason why they include this bizarre concept of non-religion or lack of religion shape is it uses this bizarre phrase of things that shape people's lives. Now, herein lies part of the problem, that is an immensely broad concept. Whether you go to Tesco or Sainsbury's to a certain extent shapes your life. The football team you support, the rugby team, the cricket team, whether you have an iPhone or an Android in this day and age shapes your life. And so that gets to part of the problem with religious education is it is too broad, and there is a desire in a multi-confessional state and now a multi-religious state. Fundamentally, we are post-secular and very.
But we have lots of values.
But we have
heaps and heaps of values.
Values
and faith.
Well,
lots and lots of faith, as in faith leaders.
Yes.
Faith communities.
Yes.
Faith all over the place.
And those of all faiths and none.
And none.
So herein lies the problem, that the Butler Act, whilst interestingly it is not confessional, as I think we've drawn that distinction, the Butler Act, whilst the Church of England still has a privileged role in the education of the nation, and indeed the churches more generally, along with some, there are Jewish schools and a few Muslim schools, but broadly speaking, education is done by the Christian churches in this country for historic reasons.
Now, the report says specifically, the problem with the way it is taught at the moment is that too many religions are included in the school curriculum. And that is why pupils emerge at the age of 15 or 16 with such a superficial knowledge of religion. One of those instances, perhaps, of drinking deeply might make us less intoxicated.
Absolutely.
A little knowledge can be a very dangerous
As
thing
opposed
where
to
religion is concerned.
Mixing our drinks. I mean, yes, the problem that the report identifies is that currently there is almost a buffet approach. That you might spend 1 week on Sikhism, 1 week on Christianity, 1 week on Hinduism, 1 week on Islam, and that's your sort of religious knowledge done.
The report quotes various aspects of this superficiality. Children emerging, for example, with the view that Christmas is God's birthday.
Yes, and Jesus came to tell us to pick up litter.
Yes.
That was another sort of horror. One, interestingly, as an aside, one's reminded of all those reports by the Henrician commissioners where they sort of went round and said, there are priests who can't recite the Lord's Prayer and think the Lord's Prayer is the Lord's Prayer because it was given by our Lord the King, and that sort of thing. So a lack of religious education isn't anything new. In fact, ignorance of religion is we almost ought to have that as our point of base assumption, because religion is very complicated. If you were to say to the academics who spend their whole life working on Christian concepts of the atonement or Buddhist concepts of the afterlife, oh, well, you do that in a minute with a group of children, they'd be horrified.
A knowledge of what Christianity involves, what Christian doctrine says, is fundamental to an understanding of the terrible religious condition of the English and the other three nations of the United Kingdom in the 16th and 17th centuries.
Absolutely.
You can't really understand all that without knowing what the problem was about different understanding of the Eucharist.
Absolutely. And it might be worth us now sort of giving the historical context of all this. What is the relationship between religion and education?
Historians who specialise and teach and lecture history of early modern England and Europe, they are in fact doing religious education.
Correct.
So you could do that bit of the curriculum and emerge with an understanding of the Christian component in religious education. But it's the aspect of knowing about a religion Now the Ofsted report is quite interesting about this. It makes a distinction between history, geography, foreign languages, and religious education. It says there are ways of knowing how to know about a religion. In other words, that it's not enough to get out your doctrinal formulae and say, 3 in 1, Trinitarian,
Credo in unum Dei,
all of that,
exactly.
all of that stuff. There's an emphasis on knowledge of what it is to live religiously. I think this is, it's interesting. I mean, it's an additional element in a very heavy, loaded curriculum anyway.
It is, and I think it perhaps speaks of the slightly modern or postmodern attitude that this curriculum has been shaped by. Why is religious education important to a civil servant? Well, to a civil servant who they themselves don't attend church, probably. They live somewhere in London and they think they can live without religion. But it is important for them to understand religion because it shapes community. And
that's the other great buzzword, isn't it?
The other great
Faith
buzzword,
and community.
It shapes community, and the way people live in community affects the way that they act. And the way they act is of interest to the government, because if they act outside the bounds of what is acceptable, or what is considered to be the accepted norm, the Overton window, however you want to term it, then that becomes a problem for the government, for the state. And so the extent to which there is this very interesting thing, as you say, that it's about knowing how people act as a Christian, as a Sikh, or as a Hindu. That, I think, perhaps speaks of a sort of almost a top-down civil service sort of shaping of the curriculum, which is a problem across the board, but specifically a problem
shaping
here.
of knowledge, shaping of human behaviour.
Precisely. And therefore, then religion becomes not something of interest in and of itself, but becomes something that you sort of almost get into the mindset of. Learn to sort of look through that person's eyes as far as one can, and then move on to the next one. Hence, you then get a tick box sort of approach of saying, well, I've learned how to think. This week, I've learned how to think as a Jain. Next week, I'll learn how to think as a Methodist.
Yes. Well, let's imagine that stink that would be created were the government of the day to adopt a codicil to the 1944 Act and say, yes, religious education, very important, very good thing. Taking on board the criticism from the Ofsted Inspectorate that too many religions are being taught. So let's do another deep dive into these faith communities and just emerge with Christianity and Islam and Judaism. That would be incredibly controversial.
Oh, absolutely. People would be furious, and this is the problem that simultaneously we are seeking to educate in a way that preserves a necessarily pluralistic society. Yet, I would argue it is almost impossible to teach these religions without an element of saying, well, this is true. This aspect is true, and it comes to the finest theologian in the Bible, Pontius Pilate. What is truth? And when you are teaching, educating, part of it is you are giving people the tools by which they discern the truth. What we currently have a problem of is that you are simply saying, well, here are 15 different religions. I'm not going to comment on the relative truth claims of them in any way, shape, or form. So this is what they do.
Presupposes also, surely, Fergus, that each of these churches, great world religions, form in themselves an unity.
Indeed.
And as soon as you get into the heart of these religions, the diversity, the internal diversity,
Absolutely.
is surely astonishing.
Absolutely.
And it's not just a question of fundamentalist evangelicals versus a more Catholic-minded view of the history of Christianity. Even within those traditions, there are internal varieties. So teaching that is just not going to be possible.
No.
You might get the pupils to understand a few fundamental facts about what is taught in these three religions. But superficiality, surely, is... here's another contemporary buzz phrase coming up, baked in.
It is.
It's baked into this whole tradition, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I speak as someone who has taught GCSE
You have
religious studies. And you know, the school I taught at made a very clear decision that we would only teach Christianity, that we would teach essentially when a paper comes up and there's an ethical issue. Let's say it's the death penalty. Okay. And what the pupil is required to do in their essay, their 6-mark or their 12-mark essay, is give religious and non-religious views about the death penalty. So the non-religious views might be, well, you know, people should be punished, it's a deterrent, etc. Or the power of the state is not so much as they have the right to take away a life. Easy, parked. Those are non-religious views. The religious views, in our case, what we chose to teach was a Christian view. Necessarily, you know, Christian teaching on the death penalty is about as broad from, you know, activists for it in the United States who are Baptist pastors all the way through to, you know, the key people advocating for its abolition who are largely, I think, Franciscan nuns. Yes. Both would call themselves
Bianca
Christians.
Jagger.
And Bianca Jagger, lest we forget.
Yeah. From George Bush to Bianca Jagger. A wide spectrum.
Bianco de Siena to Bianca Jagger. Quite.
But how about this as a solution then? That we get rid of the religious education label. Would some of the objections to the way in which religious education is taught in schools, might they be got rid of if all pupils had to have some kind of a philosophy curriculum instead? So that you would have world philosophies, Christianity being, you know, examples just sort of philosophy, but there would be perhaps less of a bulging diversity. There would be more of an underlying kind of core understanding of what one wants to convey.
Perhaps. I think perhaps...
So you'd have, you know, ethics from Christian perspective, ethics from a Islamic perspective.
Well, this is what in fact, at the A level, you know, when they're into sixth form, this is really what it does do, and it's a considerably better course, the A level course, I have to say. And you look at the way the Ofsted review is largely dealing with prior to the age of 16, you know, teaching. It does mention it briefly, the A level, but the A level is, in many ways, it seeks to do exactly that. It's in 3 parts. There is ethics, you know, they're taught ethics, and that includes Aristotle, includes Kant, includes all kinds of, you know.
I have myself taught this.
Indeed. So it's, and then it has.
It appeals to a lot of very disillusioned 17, 18-year-old scientists.
It's very interesting. It was invariably, when I taught it, the favourite subject of the pupils doing it. Yeah. So we taught ethics, we taught philosophy of religion. So that involved, you know, everything from Wittgenstein on the nature of religious language, all the way through to, you know, the nature of religious belief. You know, James, Jung, etc., and the nature of religious experience. Yes. And then there was a paper on theology as well, which was actually really very solid and interesting textual work. And again, there's a whole sphere here that would be enormously interesting if we're thinking about, to use another appalling phrase, deployable skills.
Deployable skills, indeed.
What is it that certainly the Abrahamic faiths have at their heart? Well, it's textual analysis. And textual analysis at stakes, you know, above and beyond you're going to be asked to do in your, you know, desk job. Really the most important textual analysis of all. What way leads to salvation? And I have to say, giving a room of, you know, 17-year-olds the prologue of John doesn't sound like something that would stimulate them, but it does.
It does. There is an argument, of course, for the Christian component in religious education being there if you want to go on and understand some of the great classic texts of English literature.
Absolutely.
And the nature of the historical development of society in England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. And what strikes me when I dip a toe back into the world of teaching and lecturing is the very widespread ignorance about these fundamental tools, you know, of the trade. I mean, you can't possibly understand the novels of D.H. Lawrence, for example, unless you understand that his particularly kind of English dissenting take on the world and so many fundamentally, I would say, a religious attitude towards nature.
It fuses everything. How can one understand the way in which the development of modern astrophysics and our understanding about the cosmos occurred without understanding the pre-Copernican worldview, without understanding the creation narratives in Genesis, without understanding the way in which those before looked up at the skies and thought in relation to what Scripture had told them. One can't necessarily understand that development. Now, that might not affect how one measures the gas from a far off star, but it does affect the fact that we think about measuring that, and so the presuppositions that are necessarily informed by religion, that are across every discipline, are vastly important. And to sort of to have people going into those spheres ignorant of where those presuppositions come from is well, not necessarily a dangerous thing, but a thing that will necessarily cause us to do one step forward, two steps back.
Milton, once still regarded by some as second greatest national poet, not very much read, I think, now, but anybody who wants to get a grip with the kind of English nationalism that is the basis of Milton, Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, you need a grasp of the biblical language and the particular kind of heresy to which Milton felt very attracted, Arianism and all that.
And of course, all this is happening.
Though I do rather think, that a religious studies, a religious education teacher walking in and embarking on a study of Arianism with these tender minds would be perhaps like to be thought of like the vicar going into the Sunday morning service and getting up to preach, and four rather bemused elderly ladies in the congregation, and the preacher saying, "Now I know what's going through your minds at the moment. This reeks of Sabellianism."
Yes, I suspect it would be a little sort of, daunting. But what's interesting is, of course, the acceptance of the importance of religion in all these things is actually happening at the academy level. At the level of, there is the post, one hesitates to call it the Tom Holland effect, but the role of, there is a moment happening in terms of historians and people who are specialists in English literature, where they are acknowledging that actually these ideas do not come from nowhere.
There's a very popular religion course that Foreign Office diplomats go on these days.
Yeah.
And these are guys, early and mid-careers, 20s, 30s and 40s. Yeah. They feel they don't know enough about religion.
Well, I know
religion is the kind of bread and butter stuff of modern diplomacy.
Absolutely, and shaping the world continuing to this day. But so we're accepting that at that level. And so therefore it strikes me as bizarre that we wouldn't be thinking, well, how do we equip? To save us having to put on, for the first year in English at the University of Oxford, they have to sit through a lecture on the Bible because none of them know about it. As you say, diplomats being put through their paces on faith. To sort of save us that trouble, surely the education system ought to be equipping people for what is, no two ways about it, becoming a more religious world, even if this country is becoming less religious.
So this might be an argument, in your terms, of making all of this religious education stuff absolutely compulsory.
I think there is an argument for that, in the way that I think, until recently modern languages were compulsory up to a certain level. I think actually there is an equivalent argument for religious studies being the next one that is made compulsory. And again, I go back to where we started. It's fascinating that it was chosen as the fourth one after the three compulsory subjects of maths, science and English. Because it strikes me that is Ofsted saying something about its real importance in the world more generally, and perhaps about the parlor state of it now.
It may not be possible to define religion, but we know it from its effects, and that's why religious studies are out there among the most important aspects of contemporary education in England.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.